Up until the early 1980s, there were some stringent laws about how toys could be marketed to children. Toy makers did not have the option of animated television shows and could only dream of cinematic universes. However, one medium was available to toy makers, and that was comic books. In comics, toy companies could give backstories to their plastic creations in the hopes that children would buy them on the shelf. Toyline comics almost served as a brochure for the brand, and the best part was kids were actually willing to pay for it. Hello, I'm Brian, and this is Toy Ventures, and this week we're going to talk about the 5 best and the 5 weirdest comic books based on toy lines. Let's jump in. Just to set some boundaries, I am talking about comics sold on the newsstands, not the pack-in comics, even though those are amazing. Also, for this exercise, I am going to exclude things like Secret Wars or Superpowers because they were existing comic characters, and it only makes sense that a comic book tie-in promotion was going to happen. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the weird, shall we? Number 5, Atari Force, DC Comics. Atari Force initially began life as some licensed pack-in comics in Atari 2600 video games. It was somehow spun off into an ongoing DC series in 1984. Atari Force is not a bad comic, not at all. In fact, it's quite good at times. Its art was by the legendary Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, and the stories were by Jerry Conway. The trouble with Atari Force is it has literally nothing to do with the video games. It could have been called Space Force or Star Force and sold just as well. But like a lot of kids, I liked Atari and bought this. Number 4, Robotech Defenders, DC Comics. For a brief moment in time, the name Robotech was used to sell Revell model kits that were based on Japanese shows such as Macross and Dougram. This DC title promised some serious mecha action, and being a preteen boy at the time, we were craving that. The major issue was a company called Harmony Gold was busy adapting the show Macross for the US market, and they were not super happy seeing their character designs in another comic. A deal was struck, and Harmony Gold dubbed their new series Robotech. And this series was cut short after just 2 issues and swept right under the rug. I was not happy about this. I was promised mecha action, and it was a really, really long wait for Pacific Rim. Number 3, Team America by Marvel Comics. During the 1970s, Marvel Comics developed a relationship with Ideal Toys, and in the past had developed pack-in giveaway comics for lines like Evel Knievel and Star Team toys. Team America was actually spun out of the Evel Knievel toy line, basically its molds. Evel Knievel was one of the biggest sellers in the 1970s that was stopped all too soon by someone's bad behavior. The new comic follows the story of 5 Daredevil riders whose mothers all happen to have been experimented on by Hydra, which gave them mutagenic powers. When together, the powers summon a being known as the Marauder, who also has a motorcycle. It's like a Voltron, but it's just a 6th guy, which I guess means they always have a designated driver if they hang out together. Despite being set in the Marvel Universe, having cameos from characters like Captain America, and being written by the legendary J.M. DeMatteis, who often said he was forced to do it, Team America did not catch on and drove off into the sunset after 12 so-so issues that I may or may not have purchased and read vigorously for reasons I certainly can't remember. Number 2, Mantech Robot Warriors by Archie Comics. Mantech was a clunky series of robotic toys from Remco. The mid-1980s were a highly competitive era for action figures, and Mantech just simply could not compete. The comic book series that Archie brought to the world also didn't fare any better. Despite having art by Dick Ayers, the story of 3 stranded astronauts who get their heads put on robot bodies and then enlisted to save an alien planet from robots, it just failed to sell past 4 issues. One of the things you pick up from the comic is The Mantech team likes to fight amongst themselves, and you really do get the impression that they might not even like each other, and well, I don't think kids really like them either. Number 1, US1 Marvel Comics. How do you make a comic book about a slot car toy? The answer is quite simply, no thank you. Based on a racing set by Tyco, US1 is the story of Ulysses Solomon Archer. Get it? A trucker with a special metal plate in his head that helps him pick up radio signals. Somehow that's a bonus in this comic. I don't know how. That sounds like it would be an awful existence. The comic also had villains called the Highwayman and Baron Von Blimp. Guess what he drives? US1 not only would make this list, it would make worst comics list on its own merit. It stinks bad, and for some reason it got a dozen issues. Who was buying it? With the weirdest off our chest, let's talk about some of the best comics on Toyline, shall we? Beginning with number 5, Shogun Warriors Marvel Comics. Taking 3 of the Jumbo Mashinder brands that Mattel had dubbed the Invincible Guardians of World Freedom, the Shogun Warriors comic followed 3 young people, each an expert in their own field, as they were recruited to pilot Raydeen, Combattra, and Danguard Ace. These 3 young warriors had to protect Earth from a great evil that had been slumbering after the Great Chaos Wars. The evil Lord Mara Khan and his agents were combining sorcery and super science to create monstrous servants of evil. The Shogun Warriors comic was written by Doug Moench, who had no inkling of the Japanese backstories these characters had. He was inspired to do it because of the reaction his children had to the toys themselves. This series followed 3 characters created by Moench, Richard, Genji, and Ilongo, and it was set in the Marvel Universe. Shogun Warriors only lasted 20 issues, and it's largely believed that the licensing was ending, so they actually were able to wrap up the series and remove these 3 Shoguns from the Marvel Universe. They were destroyed, and Richard, Genji, and Ilongo are now just living their lives in the MCU. Number 4, Captain Action, DC Comics. Captain Action was a 1967 ideal toy line that featured a superheroes whose main powers were to turn into other superheroes. This was done by you buying the licensed outfit sets. Kids could make the Captain into characters like Batman, Flash Gordon, the Phantom, and even Spider-Man. DC Comics licensed the Captain for a series, but they had a challenge on their hands. That is, how exactly do you make him interesting when you really can't use his main selling feature? It's not like he can turn into Spider-Man. Thanks to the teaming of a young Jim Shooter and the legendary Wally Wood and Gil Kane, Captain Action became archaeologist Clive Arno, who thanks to some mystical coins, gains superpowers. He is joined by his son, who goes under the moniker Action Boy, as they fight his former father-in-law, Dr. Evil. The Captain Action stories can get a little trippy and feel a little experimental at times, but they're a ton of fun. It starts off like a stock DC book, including a cameo by Superman. Then it kind of quickly veers off into Marvel territory with crazy visuals, high concepts, and the drama set to 11. They're good comics on their own, and luckily they had a re-release not long ago. Number 3, ROM, Space Knight, Marvel Comics. ROM was Parker Brothers' attempt to get into the action figure market. It was a high-tech, high-price robot with lights and sounds and very, very limited articulation. It was a little bit of a dud on the toy aisle. The Marvel comic, written in conjunction with the launch of the toy, was the complete opposite. It did not help sell the toy, but readers bought the comic. Headed by Bill Mantlo and art by Sal Buscema, ROM told the story of a Galadorian who gives up his body to become a cyborg to battle the evil dire wraiths who are currently invading the Marvel Earth. The ROM comic lasted 7 years and built a significant fan base. There has been comic reboots and talk of movies, and hey, ROM is one of our mascots here at PlaidStallions. Number 2, The Micronauts by Marvel. Bill Mantlo had tackled this toy line just before ROM, making him the all-star of this list. Based on the Mego Micronauts toy line, Mantlo conceived the idea after his son received the toys for Christmas. The toys had little to no backstory when released, which was pretty common, so Mantlo used them as avatars for his imagination and unleashed the legend of the Microverse. A mini cosmos set within the Marvel Universe, Mantlo would draft the story of a band of ragtag rebels in their battle against the despotic Baron Karza. The Micronauts comic was also gorgeously illustrated by Michael Golden, whose unique style really gave it a life of its own. The comic would prove so successful that it would run well past the Toyline's cancellation, and even past Mego's cancellation when it went bankrupt in 1983. This is one of those times where this really, if it was totally personal, this would be my number one. I mean, no comic had a greater impact on me on that age. But my number one choice, I think, is me being objective and fair. Before we get to number one, let's talk about some honorable mentions, some runners-up. Transformers by Marvel. This comic series had a long, healthy run, and it's beloved by fans. I was never much of a reader, but I won't ignore how important and impactful this comic was to the toy line. Masters of the Universe by DC Comics. I'm very fond of the initial limited He-Man comics made in conjunction with DC. However, when Mattel went to Marvel and they published the comic under the Star brand, it just basically felt like a soft adaptation of the Filmation series, and I felt like something was lost there. Power Lords, DC Comics. I always found Power Lords kind of an off-putting toy line, and I mean that as a compliment. It really was kind of an out-there concept. I also think that DC Comic was seriously trying to play off that. It's probably why it didn't go anywhere, but I remember buying that comic and thinking it was good and weird. Barbie by Marvel. Yeah, I'm not a Barbie collector, but I can't ignore that she had a successful 63-issue run with Marvel in the early 1990s, and that's longer than some of the comics I'm celebrating on this list. Well done, Barbie. Also, if I can just mention that I have 10 issues of Toy Ventures magazine available in our store. The link is below. If you like the vintage content we do on this channel, this is the print magazine for you, and I hope you'll check it out. Thanks for listening. Number 1, G.I. Joe, Real American Hero by Marvel. The Real American Hero line would see the return of the long-absent G.I. Joe triumphantly coming to toy shelves. Hasbro was still restrained by children's advertising laws, and they found a strange loophole. Sure, a toy commercial could not have animation, but those rules did not apply to a comic book. So in 1982, we were treated to mind-blowing animation for G.I. Joe issue number 1, which you better believe I purchased. However, once we got the issue, we noticed something. It was really well done. Great art by Herb Trimpe, and some fantastic writing by Larry Hama. For me, Larry Hama is G.I. Joe. His writing style did not talk down, and the characters were compelling with their own distinct personalities. While my time playing with G.I. Joe was limited to about a single year, I carried on with that comic for years to come. Like all the comics on the best list, I think this elevated the brand and made it better. And every time they make a G.I. Joe movie, I can't believe they differ from what worked, like these comics. I'll never get it. I'm sorry. So that's my retrospective on Toyline comics. I would love to know your opinion. What is your favorite Toyline comic? What is your weirdest Toyline comic? Let me know in the comments below, or drop me a line at our Facebook group, PlaidStallions. Thanks for watching this week, especially if you made it all the way to the end. That really helps out the channel. If you're new to this, please consider hitting like and subscribe. We do this every week. If you're not new, please consider hitting like and share. We'll be back in a few days with a podcast. Until then, be well and talk toys, not other people. Cheers.